The Chinese housing market is about to take a crash. Let's talk about it.
A massive protest over frozen bank deposits turned violent in Zhengzhou in China.
Home buyers in more than 50 Chinese cities are defaulting on their debts, and they are doing it willingly.
Here's what we know. It all started with a company called Evergrande. Evergrande is one of the largest companies in China, with interests in everything from real estate to electric cars. Now, the thought was because of Evergrande's reach, that they were essentially too big to fail. Now, the company had $300 billion in outstanding debt, and they defaulted on their promise to pays, wreaking a slow havoc on the Chinese property market. Now, this wasn't something that happened swiftly. It actually took many years to manifest, and we're seeing some of the effects of that today. After the Evergrande default, the Chinese government started taking things in their own hands, and they began to curb booming property prices. Now, for those of you who don't know, property represents more than 2/3 of all household assets in China. More than 80% of the population own homes. Talk about the American dream, owning a home in the United States. Well, in China, it's the Chinese dream. The property sector in China accounts for 30% of China's GDP. Now, how did this crisis start? Well, it all started after the 2008 global recession. An emerging Chinese middle class flocked to real estate as a hedge against market volatility, thus driving home prices through the roof. The Chinese housing market grew six-fold over the last 15 years, without relent. The boom led to speculative buying as new homes were pre-sold by property developers. Now, this word pre-sold is important to understand. Property developers would take a large down payment as a way to fund the project. So people would essentially be paying for a mortgage way before their home would even be built. And sometimes that project would take years in and of itself. And then in 2020, because of the COVID crisis, the Chinese housing market hit a slump. This is in part due to the nationwide lockdowns that took place as well, preventing people from working, going to school, or being with their family. Now, the government tried for years to slow down this ticking time bomb. Shortly after 2020, the government began putting new regulations in line in order to reduce reckless borrowing. This was something called the 3 red lines. It set up specific thresholds for developers' liabilities, debt, and cash holdings. And annual borrowing would be capped depending on how many thresholds were met. Now, the problem was those developers that found that they didn't have enough cash on hand to continue their projects began asking for more money. And this is what many people call the great Ponzi scheme of the Chinese housing market. You'd ask for more money to fund projects that you weren't able to finish. And because you weren't able to finish them, you'd go seeking new prepayments for your projects. And this happened over and over and over again. And eventually people began to catch on to it. Now, just like Evergrande, many of these large developers are also facing the same fate. They're running out of money and they're not able to finish the projects that they've promised the Chinese people. Now, this brings me to the so-called ghost cities that are rampant throughout Chinese provinces. These ghost cities are underdeveloped areas of buildings after buildings and apartment after apartments of unfinished projects. They have everything from malls to playgrounds to mirror replicas of the Eiffel Tower. Amusement parks are literally abandoned. Now, in order to bolster sales, some Chinese real estate developers are even beginning to accept crops as a form of down payment. People can pay up to $23,000 of a down payment using wheat. Now, even still, home prices have dropped for 11 consecutive months, and they don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. Now, with the Chinese government's zero tolerance for COVID, this isn't helping the situation either. Several news stations have reported leaked footage from inside China's walls of people protesting and picketing because they're unable to work or go to school or again see their family. The Chinese Communist government is heavily cracking down on these types of campaigners. Now, this is like a giant game of falling dominoes. The Chinese housing market is about to burst, but that's not the biggest problem. It's actually putting a huge strain on the Chinese banking system. Now, as this unravels, it becomes a huger problem for the Chinese government. The Chinese banks are being squeezed on 2 parts. The asset side of their balance sheet, because of the bad loans and the people refusing to pay their mortgages because they're not getting what they've been promised, and the liability side, because now some people are starting to take their money out of their bank accounts. That's what we call a run on banks. Now, this is almost like a scary foreshadow of what could potentially happen in the US as well. And I don't say that lightly. I say that because we've seen it in the past. Through the Great Depression, there was moments where there was a run on banks and people people went and took all their money out of the banks. And because of that, the banks began to close their doors and cut off people from accessing their money. And that, my friends, is a scary situation. Now, the government is trying to step in and do their part and save face because of the race that they're in with the United States to be the #1 powerhouse economy in the world. The State Council recently passed a bailout policy of upwards near $44 billion. They've also went as far as slashing interest rates. Now, some experts are saying that this enormous bailout package and the slashing of interest rates isn't going to be enough to stop this locomotive from a disastrous ending. Now, that's not even all of it. China is currently going through a horrific heat wave and drought, which is putting further pressure on the energy grid. Businesses are being forced to shut down, schools are letting out early, electricity is being limited to some homes, not to mention the crisis that's currently happening in Taiwan. After Nancy Pelosi recently visited Taiwan, China's been holding live military drills around the island. Well, we've recently done videos about the perfect storm here in the United States and how several factors are lining up to crush the US economy. It looks like China's experiencing their own perfect storm as well. Now, your question is probably, hey Mark, how is this going to affect the US economy or the world economy? Well, as far as our research have done, there's going to be several factors that are going to have an impact on the US or the global economy. Number one, this could affect the US stock market. Over 300 businesses in China and Hong Kong with over $2.4 trillion in market value are currently at risk of being kicked off the US stock exchange. Now, amongst these biggest companies, some of them are China Life, PetroChina, China Petroleum and Chemical, Alibaba, and Baidu, which is like the Chinese version of Google or its mother company, Alphabet Inc. Number two, it's going to impact our supply chain and the global supply chain. US imports from China account for more than 20% of all imports. And some of the larger categories are electric equipment, machinery, furniture, toys and outdoor equipment, and plastic parts. This could also have an impact on US Treasury bonds. Now, as China's growth continues to decline, it could have an effect on America's ability to issue new debt. You see, China's the second largest holder of US Treasury bonds. Yes, we're in debt to China, heavily in debt. As China's exports to the United States decline, its government has less dollars on hand to purchase US Treasuries. Now, the Chinese government currently gets these dollars from Chinese companies that receive them for payment of exports. And this could also affect the value of the US dollar. As China's demand for US Treasury falls, so will the demand for the US dollar. As a matter of fact, China is currently partnering with Russia to come up with their own world currency and eventually plan to decouple themselves from the US dollar. Now, if that were to happen, that would cause a disastrous blow to the United States dollar, essentially crippling our whole financial system. Now, we're going to do our best to stay on top of the situation and to bring more trending videos like this, and we hope you'll do the same by subscribing to the channel and giving it a big thumbs up, as that will help us get our reach out to more people. And if you like the content presented in today's video, please go ahead and share this to your social media profiles. Let me know what your comments are. Let me know what you learned. Let me know what maybe some of the things that I missed that we can talk about in future videos. Let's get a conversation started below. And as always, make sure you live loud, laugh louder, and learn to be a better you. We'll see you in the next video.